Welcome everyone to another build episode, this time for another Spellblade build. This build is different in the sense that I will not be using Maw of the Black City. So therefore it will not be as strong as possible, but I wanted to change things up a little for those that prefer a more interactive game. This build is still incredibly strong, so don't worry, you still won't be struggling a whole lot. This build is also very malleable, so you can switch some things around while keeping the core idea if you prefer. And I will be going over those options. I really wanted to showcase two super strong, underrated things in this game, with those being the Coral Tip unique blade and the Tempest ability. Let's get into the early game. As always, mages have a very weak early game. If you would like the strongest early game possible, I recommend watching my previous video for Evoker Mage and utilizing that for the first 20 levels, then respeccing into this one. With that being said, this is still a perfectly strong alternative and fits better with the Orb and Dagger playstyle. In character creation, the usual best mage choices are the best for this build. Shadow Dragons for mana regeneration in the early game, and Mournwatch for the additional affliction benefits. As always, I would recommend choosing your favorite faction over the benefits that they provide. The primary spells in the early game will be Chain Lightning, Tempest, and Storm Surge. Chain Lightning is quite honestly not super good, and is only the best use of your mana in very niche situations. Tempest will almost always do more damage, stagger, and CC, so you should be using your mana on that one. However, this ability just happens to work better than Arcane Shot in this build, so it gets a spot at the table. Tempest, as I mentioned earlier, is super strong and one of my favorite abilities in the game. Tempest is incredible in this build in particular and really works towards making it as strong as possible. Tempest offers incredible CC, damage, and stagger in the early game and is in my opinion possibly the mage's strongest ability on its own, without factoring in any passive boosts. It's really a jack of all trades ability and does a ton for us, especially in the early game. Always run into the fray and use this ability right away in the early game to help control the battlefield. Lastly, we have Storm Surge. This obviously synergizes well with this build being a strike spell, and electric, but the number one reason we use it is because it is a cooldown ability, meaning we can pretty much just use it whenever we want, instead of wasting valuable Tempest mana on this super mediocre ability. Here's what the skill tree should look like at level 30. For the early game, be aware of one very key passive. That passive is Spirit Blade. This build will heavily utilize arcane bombs, so if you want to use this build, you need to get used to putting them on targets and detonating them all without being hit. Spirit Blade is the key to this. It allows you to detonate targets from afar, so get used to chaining this ability after your attack combo. For the early game equipment, I recommend just experimenting and trying out whatever weapons and armor you would like. It's not really possible to make a cohesive build in this game in the early game, so just grab whatever sounds good or deals the most damage. Now after level 20, we will get to Spellblade specialization, which offers a ton of benefits for the Arcane Bomb playstyle, and gives us a very strong ability in Voidblade. Voidblade is a very nice ability and will be taking the place of Chain Lightning in the build. Due to a passive we get called Blast Efficiency, this ability will cost a lot less mana, making it much more efficient than Chain Lightning. Tempest is still much stronger than Voidblade, so definitely continue prioritizing your mana on Tempest instead of Voidblade, but if you find you have excess mana, start slashing some people up with Voidblade. You will have excess mana quite often. There really is no substantial difference from the early game for Tempest or Storm Surge. Just continue spamming Storm Surge on cooldown and prioritize Tempest over Voidblade with your mana. By now, you should probably have realized how incredibly strong Tempest is, especially with all the late game passives we will be acquiring to boost it. For ultimate, choose whichever one you would like. Both of the ultimates are pretty mediocre, so just use whichever one you find to be the most fun for you. For late game passives, there really isn't any you need to know about to maximize the build. Just know that all of our abilities are strike oriented and most of the passives are boosting those abilities up. They are mostly focused on creating the strongest Tempest ability possible. The weapons we will be using are the Veil Song, Thorn of Misfortune, and Spirit Caller. Veil Song is really nice for this build because even though we are not necessarily building directly into stagger, this build is just inherently very stagger heavy from the shock status effect. So we just get more damage and another damage opportunity with takedowns. For daggers, I want to provide you with 3 choices, the primary choice being Thorn of Misfortune. If you're just looking for the highest damage possible from this build and are not worried about being hit, then this is the best choice. If you want to do something more unique and defensive, then I recommend the Coral Tip. I use this a ton in my testing and I think it's a crazy strong unique. You are basically casting Frost Nova permanently with this blade, which is obviously crazy strong. I would recommend at least giving it one try. This unique blade is acquired from Arlithan Forest after completing the quest Cataranda the Storm Rider. Lastly, I will say Time-Worn Mage Knife is another great option. This build has really high innate stagger already, so with a little bit of passive reworking, you can change this build from a purely damage build into a stagger build if you prefer. I initially tried to push this build into a stagger playstyle, but I found it slightly less rewarding than just raw damage. For staff, we're just going with the Spirit Caller. It's not a great staff, but none of the other options really do anything at all for us, so let's just grab a little bit more resist since we're in such close range. The helmet of choice is Karast's Double Hat. If you're using 3 abilities with the same type, this is just by far the best choice. It has high innate ability damage, gives us even more ability damage through its passive, and refunds a good amount of mana, allowing for more spam. The armor we're going with is the Garb of Kinship. I just can't not use this armor. It's pretty much the best choice on every build, or at the very least, the easiest choice. Every good build in this game uses advantages to the point where you pretty much are always getting a big damage boost from this armor piece, and also getting healing. The amulet we're going with is the Crow's Perch Medallion. We have 3 strike abilities, so naturally having the amulet that makes those 3 abilities better is a pretty easy choice. The main rings of choice are Brass Root and Focus of the Veil, with a few additional options. Both Brass Root and Focus of the Veil offer nothing interesting or unique, they simply just add more damage to our electric build. However, I will leave you with 2 additional choices, those being the Amaranthian Loop and Call of the Hall. As mentioned previously, this build does have high innate stagger, so building either fully into stagger or a hybrid between the 2 builds is also a great option, and these 2 rings work great for that. Either way, I do recommend going Call of the Hall in the early game, as it's a very easy unique to acquire, as all you need to do is beat the Hall of Valor questline and defeat 10 groups of enemies. This is really easy to do early on, and stagger in the early game is much more prominent and helpful. For the belt, I changed things up a little bit and went with the Jumper's Binding. I usually go with my Twin Buckle Binding, but because we have 3 electric abilities, why not boost them all by 15%? Finally, we come to the runes. Vivify is probably my favorite rune in the game because it allows you a free spell cast. If you don't have Tempest up, cast this rune and put a Tempest up. The other 2 runes are much less interesting. I use Escalate for the additional passive damage and Daze for its passive damage as well. For playstyle, you'll pretty much want to run into the middle of the battlefield and drop Tempest every time. Use light attacks and Spirit Blade to explode people and deal good damage. Use Void Blade on cooldown as long as you have Tempest up. Also use Storm Surge every time it comes up. Tempest will keep enemies down and out for you to blast them with Void Blade and Arcane Bombs. The absolute biggest downside to this build, and it's a pretty big one, is reaching mages, as Tempest and your orb are both very close range, so it's not a bad idea to hunt them down before dealing with the melees. As far as companions go, there really isn't any companions that I think really synergize greatly with this build, so I recommend just bringing along your favorites. Balara obviously has great synergy with electricity, and she does offer electric invulnerability, healing, time slow, and CC, so she would personally be at the top of my list. As a reminder, there is a link in the description to a full level by level guide. Let me know what you think about the build in the comments down below, and please click the like button if this video was helpful. Lastly, I want to thank those who have been supporting the channel with memberships and tips. It really means a lot. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.